Turning points change the course of our lives, whether it's a big decision, overcoming an obstacle or tragedy, or taking a leap of faith. These stories of inspiration and resilience are what Turning Point is all about. Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Turning Point. Today, we are joined by Canadian Screen Award and Juno-nominated singer-songwriter Peter Katz. Peter just released a new album last November. It is called City of Our Lives. We'll certainly be talking about that. We'll also actually play one of his songs from the album at the end of today's episode. But for sure, of course, as always, we have to start with Peter's Turning Point. So thank you so much for being here today, Peter.
It's my pleasure, Priya. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, great to have you. I know I just talked a lot about your musical career there, but I actually wanted to start with kind of the connection there between that and fitness, because that's also been a big part of your life. You actually work with a program called Faces. Really cool program. I was just reading a little bit about it. It's for high school students and it uses activities like camping, rock climbing, rappelling to help build confidence. So how did you get involved with them?
Well, there's quite a crazy story to it. I was I'll try to do the shorter version of it, but I was booked to play a show in Fort Macleod in southern Alberta, and I had toured Canada pretty extensively. I was playing between 150 and 200 shows a year at that point, but I'd never been to Fort Macleod. In fact, I'd never really heard of it. I think I'd driven through because it's just like a one kind of stoplight town. And I was booked at this place called the Empress Theater, which, I Googled it and I'm like, this beautiful theater. And I'm sort of scratching my head as to who's going to come to this show. And I walk out on stage and the place was packed and they knew all of my songs and they're singing everything back to me. And I was like, what happened here? And it turned out that I know, it was just so shocking, but the reason all those people were there was because that program Faces that you just mentioned, it's this program for teenagers and it's kind of teaching them like life skills and overcoming fears and kind of developing empathy and caring about a group, all that kind of stuff. And they had been using my music as part of the curriculum. So all of these kids every summer were learning my songs and I had no idea. So by the time I showed up there was, hundreds or thousands of people that had been exposed to my music in that area, and it was this very unexpected thing, and then they asked me to come work for them. I guess they had previously asked my manager, and he had said no, like Peter's not a camp counselor, but I was so enamored with them after this night that I have such a love of the outdoors. It's always been a big part of my life that I just said I'm going to do this. I don't know what I'm walking into, and it's become a huge part of my life. I now actually run the program for part of the summer every summer. I've done 11 sessions, and I've run like over 500 kids through the program. So it's one of the best things in my life.
Very cool. And what an interesting way for these kind of two passions of yours, fitness and music, to sort of meet in a very unexpected way.
Yeah, and it's to be honest, like we use all these activities. It's a very, very active program, but it's really more about the metaphors of those activities. Like rock climbing, we don't actually care if they get great at rock climbing, but it's like what does it mean to be stuck and then to not give up and kind of manage your emotions and then still find your way to the top, and what does it mean to kind of be consistent, and like we go for a mile run every morning. So what does it do when you do something consistently? So we use the activities, but they're not kind of standalone. They're there for a kind of teaching purpose.
I was so fascinated by that when I was reading about the program, this kind of idea of teaching life lessons through physical activity. And kind of speaking of life lessons, you were actually with this group in 2017 when your turning point happened. So tell us about that. What happened?
Well, first of all, it was my fault. So I anytime I talk about this, I never want there to be any blame on Faces, because it was really my own overtiredness and negligence that day. But we were running a rappel, and I was kind of a little bit overtired and not thinking, and the device that I normally rappel on I didn't have with me, and so I grabbed a different one that a friend of mine had. And, attached myself thinking that, this is going to kind of work the same, because I had used one before, but without getting too technical, there was a few differences. And I walked off this cliff and I just started falling, and it was a 100-foot cliff. And,
Oh my gosh.
I couldn't stop myself. I was in a harness, and so I was stayed upright, but the rope was, flying through. I tried to grab the rope. I actually ended up burning my hands quite badly. And I dropped about 100 feet in about 3 seconds, and ended up shattering my ankle, and had to have surgeries. And I kind of couldn't walk for the better part of a year. And, I still have bolts in there, and there's not a day that goes by that I'm not aware that, my ankle's been through some things, but I'm thankful that I can walk, of course.
Of course. Yeah. And this year, this year after the accident really was a roller coaster of things are getting better, things are getting worse. So tell us a little bit about that, and when you realized just how serious everything was.
Yeah, I mean, truthfully, the initial moment when I went to the hospital right after the fall, they actually thought that I hadn't broken my ankle, and they were, the doctor literally said, you're guided by angels or something, that you fell that far and you didn't break your ankle. But what the truth of it, that kind of we figured out, 4 months later, is that I'd actually had a very unusual fracture. Normally, like your two side bones kind of break off, and that's like your typical ankle fracture. But I actually shattered the talus, which is like kind of this like globe shaped bone right in the middle of your ankle, and it's pretty rare to break it because it's such a robust bone. So it kind of just like split like if you were to drop a large marble or something. So you can't sort of see a fracture, but the whole thing is kind of internally fractured. And so by the time they found it, there was this thing happening called what they thought was avascular necrosis, which is basically like the death of the bone. And that's you're getting into like permanent disability territory. I even heard the word amputation at one point. So it was very serious. And I think you sort of expect to get good news, like, for example, like when they first told me you didn't actually break it, I was like, oh yes, that's what I would expect. Like I dodged a bullet. But, when the 4-month period happened and they kept finding all this bad stuff, every time I went to the doctor, it was worse and worse and worse and worse. And, the surgeon I had was, like this really well-known ankle surgeon who's done thousands of ankle surgeries. And he said, I've never seen anything like it, which is not something you want to hear.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Wow. And, even just in the process of healing, you usually expect that the news you will get will continue to be better, right? You're like, especially after something like that. And in those first few months, you actually, you were feeling okay, right? You were able to walk and even run on your ankle.
Yeah. I mean, so the first, 6 weeks or whatever, I was on crutches and was in pain. But in my mind, I'm like, oh, okay, I just have a really badly sprained ankle. And so I went to rehab as if I had a badly sprained ankle. And I sort of built things back up to the point that I was running. In fact, the day before I walked into the hospital to get the first bad news, I had been sprinting hills in High Park, and I was sitting there with the doctor, and he said, how did you get here? I said, I drove here. He said, well, you can't drive home because you have to leave in a cast. And I was like, what are you talking about? He's like, you're basically walking around on a time bomb. Like you have this bone that's like slowly hollowing out, and at some point it's going to collapse. He's like, you need to not walk for the next 6 weeks and see if it heals. So I didn't walk for 6 weeks. And then you go in and you expect, okay, I didn't walk for 6 weeks. I suffered through that. Now everything's going to be okay. And he looks at the MRI or CT scan, and he says, it's even worse. And now we need to do surgery. And then there was another period between like it being worse and then surgery actually happening. And then once you have surgery, of course, you have a lot of trauma to the area, and then there's a whole recovery period after that. And he wasn't even sure that the surgery was going to work. So, it was a difficult period, but thankfully I had music to make, and I had wonderfully supportive people all around me too. So I was blessed in many ways, despite the challenge.
Yeah, I mean, when you start hearing words like amputation and you might not walk again, I mean, that's pretty scary stuff. And I know you mentioned your music there. Before this fall happened, you were already working on what has become your most recent album, City of Our Lives. So how important was music during that time for you during the recovery?
It was pretty fundamental, you know. So I had written, I had written like over 60 songs, and I had been sort of trying to find the sound of the album, but you know, it wasn't happening. And then when after the surgery, you know, I was kind of bedridden a lot, and I had a lot more time to kind of focus on music. And I think I also felt this as I started getting better, you know, after the surgery. I also felt this kind of emboldened sense of, you know, I have nothing left to lose here, or like there's no point in me just making another record. You know, I nearly just died, and I've been through this stuff. And so what happens if I make something that is like courageous to the max for me? And so I think, you know, you have those moments, those turning point moments, that they kind of give you this paradigm shift. And I just felt like, well, I'm not holding on to anything. I'm not going to be precious. I'm just going to make something like I've never made before. And I'm not going to worry about what people are going to, how they're going to perceive it, or the fact that it's different or anything. I'm just going to kind of follow my intuition. I think you're kind of like tapped in when you're in that place. You're kind of in this soup of vulnerability. You're like drawing on all the strength that you've got inside of you. So I in some ways, I felt at least that I was like supercharged or something.
Huh, it's so interesting because I think these times of pain and of being in unexpected places can really provide that, because you are vulnerable. I'm sure you needed to ask people to help you out when you were bedridden and all of these things, and then to end up in this place of kind of extreme creativity and being willing to take chances with your music. And it really does show, I think, also in your album. It's a completely different style. It's a pop album, which is very different from what you were producing before.
Yeah, it's definitely, you know, I was sort of known as the acoustic troubadour singer-songwriter guy, and you know, there's virtually no acoustic guitar to be found or on the album at all. And it's a, you know, it's a very, very, very different sound, but I love it. I find it so exciting, and it's really hard, I think, as a creator to actually like something once it's done, you know. Like usually by the time it's done and you're like holding it in your hands, you're like, I gotta try again next time. But I actually I love it, and I think there was so many people that came together in making it happen too, that it's not just me in there. Like all of me is in there, but then I'm the sum is larger. There's, you know, there's these producers that I worked with. There's, you know, people from my team that, you know, were there from the start of the album, and, you know, helping me pick songs and saying, no, it's got to be better, go back to the drawing board, and you know, being my therapists. And you know, there was just a literal village of people around me that made this album. And you know, I had to ultimately make the calls and make some hard calls, but I felt like I was on a mission with a bunch of people. And I think just, it's also kind of in my nature to get through hard things by like rising and like becoming even bigger than I thought I could be, you know, like like whatever the challenge is presenting me, it's like, how do I grow into the person that could get through this kind of a challenge? I think that was kind of instilled in me from a pretty young age. And there's a certain momentum to that, where the more you go through these challenges and you survive them, and you grow wiser and more gracious, and then it's not that it becomes easier, I guess, but you're stronger. It's like lifting weights or something. It's not that like lifting 200 pounds is easy, but when you've built up to it, then you like have that strength. So anyway, that's the image that's coming to mind.
Yeah, that is a really great metaphor, kind of this almost flexing your muscle of resilience and learning how to deal with these difficult situations. And I like that you said, it doesn't necessarily get easier, but maybe there's just the knowledge that things will get better after the tough stuff. And that actually makes me think of one of the songs on your album. This one was written after the fall. It's called Paper Thin. It's the song actually we're going to play at the end of this episode. But this line really stuck with me after I listened to it. So I'm just going to read it. When your biggest fear, it ends up coming true. It's when you find out what you have inside of you. I am braver than I ever could have known. And I think that really reflects kind of what you were just saying there. So what was it that inspired this line?
So I wrote that song before the fall. I produced it after.
Okay. Got it.
The production of it was really the defining moment that kind of changed the album, because it was this acoustic song that got turned into this pop song, and that's where I was like, oh, that's the sound. But that line itself was inspired through, well, my biggest fear for a good chunk of my life coming true was, my parents had gotten divorced when I was 12, and I lost my house at the same time. And so I was like, my whole life, I was like, I'm never going to get divorced and I'm never going to lose a house. And so, when I got married and I got a house, I was like, I protected those things with my life. And then of course, as we tend to do when we're operating from a place of fear, or a place of holding on, or a place of like not being willing to change or risk, it did fall apart. And so my biggest fear did come true, and I kind of repeated what had happened in my childhood. And I never thought that I'd be able to survive that, but I did. And in fact, I think a lot of the strength that I developed going through that was what really helped me through the fall. Like I said, there's this cumulative effect, I think, of, I guess it's just called resiliency, where you realize that you're stronger than you thought. And as much as we don't want to go through hard things and we try to protect ourselves from hard things, it's so consistently in those moments that we really figure out what we're made of. And we actually become stronger. We actually become more able to deal with those hard things by going through hard things. So I feel like Paper Thin is just such it really is the epicenter of the album. Like, that theme is everything of like what the album is. What, I think albums are these timestamps of life, and that is the timestamp of this period in my life. And I certainly, produced the album in a way that I tried to make it an offering to people. So I tried to make it not like an insular thing, because I know that everybody has hard things that they go through, many of which are much, much worse than I've ever been through. And so I wanted to produce the album, create it in a way that kind of allowed that accessibility for people that might be going through their own hard things to see themselves in it and kind of literally move through it. It's like the reason it's a pop album and it has that energy to it is because I find movement is such a healing force. Just sitting and thinking about stuff is not always the best. And so I wanted to offer it in a way that sort of allowed people to move through their feelings.
Yeah, and it is quite emotional and vulnerable in many moments. And I wondered as I was listening to it, because I kind of did feel like I was going on a bit of an emotional journey with you, but that the overwhelming message was, there will be tough stuff, there will be more tough stuff. But yeah, you can get through it, and there is kind of light at the end of the tunnel. But as you were creating this album, were there moments when it was tough for you to be that vulnerable?
I mean, I, everything about making the album was vulnerable, including the stylistic choice. That was probably the most vulnerable part for me. Like writing the music was so cathartic. I couldn't get it out fast enough. There's a song on the album called "Come Down," and it's a bit more like R&B, almost hip hop like lyrics. There's like a lot of lyrics, and I was sitting there writing with this guy Eric Alcock, who literally had like he'd written songs with Eminem and Pink, and all these things are up on the wall, and normally I would have been like a little bit intimidated or something like that, or in my head, but I just had so much in me to say. He's like, all right, I'm just going to build up a beat here. I'm like, okay, cool. And I just wrote like 17 verses, and then he had a piano in the room, and I just walked over and I played the chorus of the song, and he kind of turned around and looked at me, and he's like, holy moly, like you're possessed. And so much of the album was written that way, where I couldn't get it out fast enough. There was just so much to say. The really vulnerable part for me was how I ended up producing it, because I really deviated, like we already talked about, from what was comfortable to me, but that felt aligned with the theme of the record of not trying to hold on to something, and seeing what happens if I don't put limitations on myself, if I do something that scares me, but that little fire inside of my heart is saying, oh, I really want to do this. So what happens if I just do it anyways? So it's a very vulnerable process, but the actual sharing the lyrics for me, that came quite naturally, and I think that's also sort of part of my nature, is in some ways I can't help myself. I have to process through writing, and the only way that I actually feel like I've processed something is if I'm honest, and if I go there, to that place I need to go. And so that's just the way I have to write.
And this theme of really pushing yourself out of your comfort zone, whether it's, with your music, physically during your recovery after this fall, of course, after your divorce and losing your house, it's kind of really this theme of getting out of your comfort zone and then kind of coming out the other side stronger. And I know you've also really had to do that this year, because, of course, you were supposed to be on tour this year. All of that changed with the pandemic, but you've managed yet again to kind of find get out of your comfort zone and find some success in a different way. You've been doing these very cool virtual keynote performances. So you've actually spoken to more than 30,000 people virtually since March. I watched some clips of this. It's very, very cool how you mix motivational speaking with your musical performances. The reactions from people are, you can tell they're very impacted by it. It's very powerful. How did you get this idea to mix these two things together and to do it virtually?
Yeah, so the sort of I call them keynote concerts. The keynote concerts part of my life emerged a few years ago, where I'd always been somebody who told stories and stuff from stage, and people started asking me. They say, hey, we're doing a banquet, will you come give a talk? Or it kind of evolved from there, where I was asked to give talks, and then I ended up having this one particular opportunity at this conference called Fireside, which was this conference for like 500 tech startup entrepreneurs, movers and shakers, and I ended up getting put forward as someone that could give a keynote, and the person that was running that conference, actually his favorite song of all time happened to be the song that I'd written. So
Oh, wow.
maybe he had misconstrued the sense of my fame and thought I was Bono or something, but he put me as the closing keynote to all 500 people. And I'd never really done, a proper keynote at that point. And I, prepared like crazy for it, and it went really well. And then I ended up, getting with this amazing agency, Speaker Spotlight, and they booked the likes of Chris Hadfield and David Suzuki and people like that. And I ended up on that roster. And so all of a sudden I was in these totally different environments. In my music career, like when you put on a show, it's like the people don't come unless they like your music and you've built that relationship and they're hearing your song on the radio. And there's a lot of energy that you put into like doing an album release tour and selling tickets. Whereas in my speaking career, I just walk out on stage and there's 2,000 people sitting there, and I didn't post a single, update on Instagram or whatever to get anybody there. It's just like they're there to see me. And so it's quite a different challenge, but I've loved to kind of come into that space because obviously I've logged my hours on stage. I'm very comfortable on a stage. I'm very comfortable playing music. I'm very comfortable sharing stories. So I had to kind of bridge the gap of, okay, now how do I take this area of expertise that I have? Because, other speakers might be like science experts or business experts or whatever. I'm kind of a vulnerability and resilience expert, I guess, or I have friends who are actual resilience experts. So I guess I'm a vulnerability and kind of risk-taking, emotional risk-taking expert. I got to word this better for future reference.
But I hear what you're saying. Yeah.
And so the challenge is like, okay, I'm talking to all these different groups of people. How do I figure out how their experiences and my experiences overlap, and what can I draw on from my experiences that I can offer to them to be of service? So I kind of started trying to solve that riddle, and of course it varies widely. I've spoken to all kinds of different groups, and from major corporations to not-for-profits to giant professional associations to I spoke to the House of Commons of Canada. So all these different variety of people. And so when the pandemic hit, I had all of these amazing bookings. Like 2020 was going to be, my year. I was so excited, and everything got canceled. Every concert got canceled. Obviously we had huge album release plans. I had all these talks booked, Faces, the program, and so everything got canceled. And that was a terrifying moment, but like we've been talking about, the more you go through these hard things and these challenges and these moments where you're like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? The more I think there's the gap between figuring out what you're going to do and the moment of being panicked, it gets shorter and shorter. And so I had my last performance on March 12th. On March 13th, the world kind of shut down.
That's right.
And on March 14th, I took the $2,000 left that I had in my bank account and I bought the camera that I'm looking into right now. And I locked myself in this room that I'm sitting in right now. And I said, okay, I need to learn a whole new thing. I didn't know anything about live streaming. I didn't really know much about photography. I knew audio, but not like crazy in depth. And I certainly didn't know like streaming and all that kind of stuff. And I had a notion that I needed to create something that wasn't a lesser version of a live performance. Like no one would say that theater is a lesser version of movie, and no one would say that movie is a lesser version of theater. They're different things. And so I was like, okay, I need to take this format, which is going to be me staring in a camera, and I need to find a way to have it so that it's a really high value experience for my audience. And so I just kind of had my list of prerequisites for that to be the case. So obviously great video, great audio, and using the medium for what it is, right? Like when I'm in a giant theater, if I like raise my eyebrow, nobody sees that. But when I'm like this close to the camera and a little turn of my head, you can send a shiver down somebody's spine if it's in the right moment. And so I was in this room, I'm not kidding, many nights, mornings until 6 a.m. for about 3 weeks, just kind of watching blogs, reading articles, watching tutorials, buying gear, testing stuff out, just kind of trying to figure out how I could create this thing. And I eventually created it. I don't actually do it in this room. I have a whole setup upstairs. I used to have a living room. Now it's like a broadcast studio. And then I also wanted to, figure out interactivity, all these different elements. And I emerged. I did a couple of them kind of pro bono for people who asked me, and then was able to, gather testimonials and gather footage. I made a reel about this offering, and then I started going. And I, especially September, October, November, December, they've probably been the busiest months of my entire life. And I've kept a very busy schedule in my life, but I've never experienced anything like it. I mean, I had 5 events this past Thursday. There was one chunk in September where I had 9 events in 5 days. It's been amazing. And like you said, I've been able to reach 30,000 people, and I'm standing in my living room, and it's beautiful, like and that 30,000 people is not just like numbers on a screen. Almost all of those people were in Zoom rooms where I can actually see people's faces. And, we've had Zoom rooms with, some companies, there was 1,000 people in there, and we've done like epic sing-alongs with 1,000 people and all kinds of crazy things that I never would have imagined possible. But I feel very, very, very thankful for what's happened. And I certainly never would wish for a pandemic, but I think that lesson applies. Like, there's so many things that happens that we don't wish for, but how do we get through those things, and not just get through them, but grow into these better version of ourselves, grow into the kind of people that can get through those things, and not only get through them, but thrive.
And I think that message of resilience and of pivoting, of getting out of your comfort zone, trying to do things differently is really more important now than ever, especially, with this pandemic, with things being so out of our control. Really, I think that message, I know you're thankful for all of those opportunities that you've had, but I'm sure a lot of people who have received the message are also really grateful to have had that message, because it's exactly what we need right now. I am going to ask you to just indulge me for a minute here, because I know you talked about speaking, to the House of Commons, and one of the things that I read is that you had also lectured alongside Chris Hadfield, who is someone I am a huge fan of. So tell me about that experience.
Yeah, well, so the Chris Hadfield thing actually happened. That was kind of early in the days of people asking me to give keynotes, and so I was doing the International Astronautical Federation, I think. I forget the acronym exactly, but something like that. It was 4,000 astronauts at the Sony Center, and it was Chris Hadfield, Cirque du Soleil, and me.
What a mix! Wow.
Yeah, quite something. And I live for opportunities like that. Like I don't get scared when I get opportunities like that. I get excited, because I feel like, most of my life as an artist, you're kind of like banging on the door saying like, hey, give me a chance, give me a chance, give me a chance. So to do something at that production level in such company, and alongside Chris Hadfield, that I think all of us just admire so much, was an incredible thing. They gave me 12 minutes, so it was like, all right, jam pack these 12 minutes. But I can't believe how amazing that moment was. Chris Hadfield was so gracious. Backstage, he asked, he introduced himself as if I didn't know who he was. And he asked if I would sign some CDs for him. And, he was,
wow.
He was amazing. And that whole conference was amazing. The the president of NASA actually ended up quoting my song lyric in his closing remarks to the whole conference. And I even sold a CD to Buzz Aldrin that day after my talk. So that was a pretty amazing experience.
Yes, not to be too cliche, but out of this world, it sounds like.
It was out of this world, yeah. I wanted to say one thing, Priya, just on the, like, just with everything that we've been talking about, I just have this instinct inside of me to also mention that, like, amidst all of these things that I've been like able to get through and find my way, there's not a day that goes by that there's not some moment in the day where I'm not like, panicking or, stressed about something or feeling like overwhelmed, or like, I would never want people to feel like, the process of growing into these people that we want to be is somehow just like, yes, you just have to have a good attitude and then you get there. Like there are many, 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 many peaks and valleys, and there's many low points. And I think the more that you kind of step out on the edge and you're like, okay, I'm going to go for this thing. I'm going to do this scary thing. I'm going to do this thing I've never done, or this thing that's overwhelming me or has knocked me down. I'm going to pick myself up. The more that you have like bigger emotions to deal with. But I think, that the more you're willing to like move through those emotions, like I do a lot of mindfulness, I do a lot of physical activity to kind of keep things in check. The more that they kind of subside and you realize that, maybe an hour of feeling down is not the totality of you, or, I guess I just wanted to say that, like, there's a lot of moments where it's not pretty, where I'm scared, where I'm in over my head. But I think I've kind of trained myself to see those feelings where I feel overwhelmed, at least as a sign that I'm playing big, that I'm going for something. And so if I'm feeling overwhelmed, it's because I'm in the arena trying to do something big. And so I don't interpret that overwhelmed as a bad thing. I interpret it as like, oh, look at that. This is a good thing that I'm feeling this way because I'm on to something. I'm on a path. I'm up to something. I'm trying to do something. And it's normal to have these feelings that come along with that. So I just wanted to give that distinction or explanation.
Yeah, and I think that is really important. I'm just thinking about kind of going through the process of creating this show. And, obviously, now that it's out and I'm putting out all of the positive experiences on social media and everything. But there were a lot of those days where I doubted myself. I didn't think it was going to be good enough. I thought, am I the only person who's going to listen to this show or like this show, or just me and my family? And is that okay? And I think that is really important, even though maybe the end result is success and is coming through some of these dark times. Those dark times are also a huge part of that. And for anyone who might be in one of those moments right now where things are hard and it's a struggle, just to know that, like you said, it's okay to be in that, to process that, and to know that it will end and that things will get better, but not to negate the importance of going through those tough times and knowing that that's all part of the process.
I totally agree, because I have those moments listening to other people where I'm like, oh, they have it all figured out, and one of the things I do in my mindfulness practice is like, when you're having a big feeling or a big thing, you actually like turn towards it and you are with it, and you kind of turn towards that big thing, and you kind of get curious of like, okay, what is this big thing? What does it want of me? Like, oh, it's just trying to keep me safe. It's worried that something bad is going to happen. And so you can kind of like turn towards these things and acknowledge them. And as you turn towards them, they kind of soften, So I really just want to emphasize that is part of my process constantly. It's not just walking around on roses and I'm just like, yes, I've got it all figured out and I'm just endlessly successful at everything. And it's just not true.
Yeah, no, I'm really glad you brought that up, and I'm sure one of those more difficult times was when you found out that you were going to have to cancel your concerts for this year. So I know touring still probably won't happen anytime soon, but you do have some other innovative plans for showcasing your music in the next little while. So what can you tell us about that?
Well, we have a very, very exciting concert that we're doing at Roy Thompson Hall, which is, one of the most iconic venues, I think in the country, in the world. There's this beautiful, beautiful, venue. And obviously there will be no people there. But, we're going to do it on the Roy Thompson Hall stage. And, we're going to have the full band. We'll be on very distanced and, multi-cameras and, the whole vision of this album was to play these like euphoric, like everybody dancing together, but with music that has a lot of substance to the lyrics, not just like everybody take a million shots, like it was like how do you kind of merge music that has that real heart and soul to it. I'm not trying to like put down anybody else's art, but I think you're understand what I'm saying.
Yes.
But not in a way that you're together, So we're gonna try to put on a show that kind of paints the picture of that and tries to create that experience for people, even though they're going to be watching it remotely. But we want to as best as possible, or in a different way than we thought, but in a still a great way, kind of do this album justice and hopefully paint a compelling enough picture that people will want to come experience the in-person version of it someday, whenever we're safely able to do that. But I'm really excited about that. It as somebody that, like I said, was playing 150 to 200 shows a year for over a decade, it's crazy to me that I haven't, played music concerts in as long as it's been. And not to mention that, the injury and all of that stuff took me off the road. So it's been a much longer stretch than I ever would have imagined. So I'm really excited about that. I think it's going to be a really special moment to walk back out on a stage again. And then of course I have a ton of Keynote concerts and stuff that, like, the 2021 is already just filling up with all kinds of amazing organizations and people that I'm going to get to speak to. So I just feel like, I'm still getting to do what I love on many fronts. So I feel really, really grateful and excited about that.
Awesome. Well, I look forward to the virtual concert and, of course, to the in-person concert when this pandemic is over. And thank you so much for being here today, Peter. It was so great to have you.
It's my pleasure, Priya. Thanks for having me. Congrats on the launch and creating it. I'm really excited for you.
Oh, thank you so much. And I hope we get to meet in person one of these days.
We will.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Peter. Thank you to all of you who are watching and listening. We're going to leave you today with music from Peter's new album, City of Our Lives. This is Paper Thin.
I can barely even talk about it now, but I don't know any other way out. I have pushed myself so hard for all these years, still it's not clear what for, and all the roads I drive no longer lead me home. I could fill an ocean with all that I don't know. I was safer in the insides of those walls, but that's not all there is. I know everything falls apart. Ooh. falls apart.